The orphan boy found an abandoned war bunker in the forest. What he found inside was worth a fortune. Maybe you know what it feels like to be truly alone. Not the kind of alone where you can call someone or walk home to a warm room. The kind where the cold bites through your coat and nobody's waiting anywhere. If you've felt that, even for a moment, then you'll understand the story. And if this story touches you, help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Hit that button. Let's walk this path together. The boy was 11, maybe 12. Hard to say. Hunger has a way of stealing years from a child's face, leaving behind something older, something watchful. His name was Thomas, though nobody had called him that in months. The orphanage had burned down in October, and the ones who survived scattered like autumn leaves. Thomas went north, following the railroad tracks until they disappeared under snow. He found shelter in the remains of an old logging camp, 3 walls of a cabin that kept out most of the wind. Not much, but enough. Every morning he woke to frost on his eyelashes and the sound of ravens calling from the pines. Every morning he wrapped his mother's scarf tighter around his neck, the blue wool thin as paper now, and went looking for firewood. The forest was old here, the kind of old that makes you whisper. Trees so tall their tops vanished in a gray sky, and beneath them a silence broken only by your own breath and the crunch of snow under your boots. Thomas knew these woods now, knew which deadfall would burn longest, knew where the frozen creek still whispered under the ice. But today, something was different. He'd gone farther than usual, following a deer trail that wound between massive boulders. The snow was deeper here, untouched, and his legs ached with each step. He was about to turn back when he saw it, a darkness in the hillside that didn't belong. At first he thought it was just shadow, the way the rocks caught the light. But as he got closer, his breath caught. It was a door, or had been once. Heavy metal, the green, paint mostly gone, eaten away by rust and time. It sat at an angle in the hillside, half buried in snow and dead vines, like something trying to hide. Above it, barely visible under decades of moss, were letters. Military letters, sharp and official. Thomas's hands were shaking, and not just from cold. His father had been a soldier, died before Thomas could remember him, somewhere far away in a war that left behind only a folded flag and his mother's quiet tears. She told him stories, though, about courage, about men who did hard things because someone had to. He reached out and touched the metal. It was colder than the air, cold enough to burn. The door was massive, designed to keep the world out, or maybe to keep something in. Behind him, a branch cracked under snow. Thomas spun, heart hammering, but it was only the wind. The forest watched him with 1,000 patient eyes. He looked back at the door, at the darkness beyond it, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity, and maybe, just maybe, hope. Thomas stood there for a long time, just breathing. White clouds of breath disappearing into white air. The smart thing would be to walk away, go back to his broken cabin, tend a small fire. But when you have nothing, smart and foolish start to look the same. He knelt in the snow and began digging. His gloves were too thin, more holes than fabric, and soon his fingers burned with cold. But he kept going, pushing snow away from the base of the door, scraping at frozen earth. The ravens had gone quiet now. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It took an hour, maybe more. Time moved strangely in the forest, especially when you're alone. Finally, he'd cleared enough to see the whole door. There was a handle, thick and unforgiving, and beside it, a lock that had rusted through years ago. Thomas pulled. Nothing. He braced his feet and pulled again, putting his whole body into it. The door groaned, a sound like something waking up after a long sleep. Then, slowly, grudgingly, it began to move. The smell hit him first. Old air, damp earth, metal and time, and something else he couldn't name. Not death exactly, more like absence, like a place that had held its breath for decades and was only now exhaling. Before he descended, Thomas did something that might seem strange. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the heel of bread he'd been saving for supper. It wasn't much, hard as a stone and just as appetizing. But when he heard the soft whimper behind him, he turned. A dog stood at the edge of the clearing, thin as winter itself, gray muzzle dusted with snow. It wasn't aggressive, just watching with eyes that knew hunger as well as Thomas did. For a moment, boy and dog just looked at each other, two survivors in a world that hadn't been kind to either. Thomas broke the bread in half. He didn't think about it, didn't weigh whether he could afford to share. He just did it, the way his mother had taught him. Always leave something for others, she'd said, even when you have almost nothing. Especially then. The dog took the bread gently, tail giving one uncertain wag, then vanished back into the trees. Thomas watched it go, then reached into his other pocket and pulled out the letter. His mother's last letter, written in the hospital when she knew she was dying. He'd read it so many times the paper was soft as cloth, the ink fading. He didn't read it now, just held it for a moment, feeling its weight. Then he folded it carefully, put it back, and turned to the darkness. The entrance was narrow, walls pressing close. Stone steps led down into blackness. Thomas had no flashlight, only matches, and he couldn't afford to waste them. So he went slowly, one hand on the cold wall, counting steps. 20, 30. The air grew colder, thicker. At the bottom, his foot found level ground. He struck a match, and the world jumped into brief, flickering life. He was standing in a tunnel. Concrete walls, ceiling low enough to make him feel the weight of earth above. The match burned down to his fingers, and he dropped it, cursing softly. Darkness rushed back like a living thing. But he'd seen enough. Seen the tunnel stretching ahead. Seen the footprints in the dust, decades old, leading deeper. And seen, just at the edge of the matchlight, the glint of something metal. Another door. Thomas struck a second match, and this time he started walking. The second door wasn't locked, just stuck, swollen by moisture and time. It fought him for a moment before surrendering with a groan that echoed down the tunnel. Thomas stepped through into a room that smelled of rust and old stories. Have you ever been in a place that time forgot? Not abandoned exactly. Paused. Like everyone just stood up one day and walked away, expecting to come back tomorrow, and tomorrow never came. That's what this was. The match went out. Thomas struck another, his third, and in its brief life he saw a table with metal chairs, one tipped over. Canteens hanging from hooks, their canvas straps stiff and cracked. A helmet on a shelf, still holding the shape of someone's head. Papers scattered across the floor, footprints tracked through them decades ago. And on the walls, photographs. Young men in uniform, arms around each other, smiling at a future they'd never see. The kind of smiles that break your heart because you know how the story ends. Thomas's match burned out. He stood in darkness, listening to his own heartbeat. He should be afraid, maybe, but he wasn't. This place wasn't haunted by anything evil, just haunted by absence, by all the life that should have been here and wasn't. He had 3 matches left. He needed to be smart. He moved carefully through the darkness, hands out, touching walls and furniture, building a map in his mind. His fingers found something smooth and round. A candle, thick as his wrist, on a shelf. He almost laughed. Of course, they would have needed light down here. The 4th match brought the candle to life, and suddenly the room was alive with soft, yellow light. Shadows danced in corners, but they were friendly shadows. The kind that keep you company. Now Thomas could see everything. The bunker was one large room, with several smaller ones branching off. Sleeping quarters, maybe, or storage. There were maps on one wall, faded and brittle. A radio, its dials frozen. A jacket hung on a peg, sleeves hanging like it was still waiting for its owner. If this story has touched you so far, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. What city, what state? Because stories like this, they belong to all of us. They're about remembering, about the things we leave behind. Thomas moved deeper into the bunker. In one of the smaller rooms, he found cots with gray blankets still tucked tight. In another, shelves of supplies. Canned food so old the labels had faded to ghosts, water jugs, boxes of matches that would probably still light. Whoever stocked this place had planned for a long stay. But it was in the last room, the smallest one, that Thomas found what he was looking for. Though he didn't know yet that he was looking for it. A desk. A real wooden desk, scarred and solid, pushed against the far wall. And on that desk, under a layer of dust so thick it looked like snow, was a metal box. Locked. But the kind of locked that wasn't meant to last forever. Just meant to keep things safe until someone came back. The candlelight caught the box's edges, made it seem to glow. Thomas reached out slowly, reverently, and brushed the dust away. Underneath, stamped into the metal, were letters, property of SGT, James Walsh. A name. After all these years of silence, a name. Thomas's hands were shaking again. He pulled the box toward him, felt its weight. Something inside shifted, settled. Not heavy, but not empty either. The lock was old, rusted through in places. It wouldn't take much to open it. But Thomas hesitated, because opening this box felt like opening a door you couldn't close again, like stepping across a line between before and after. And once you crossed it, there was no going back. He thought about his mother, about his father who died in a war he'd never understand, about being alone in the world with nothing but a thin scarf and a fading letter. Then he thought about Sergeant James Walsh, whoever he was. Thought about how he'd locked this box and walked away, maybe thinking he'd come back, maybe not thinking anything at all. The candlelight flickered. The bunker waited. Thomas took a breath, pulled a piece of metal from the desk's broken drawer, and began to work the lock. The lock gave way easier than expected, almost like it was tired of keeping secrets. It fell to the desk with a soft click that seemed loud in the stillness. Thomas's heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. He placed both hands on the box, closed his eyes for a moment, then opened it. No gold, no glittering treasure. For a second, Thomas felt disappointment wash over him, cold as river water. But only for a second, because as the candlelight fell across the box's contents, he realized he was looking at something far more valuable than gold. Letters, dozens of them, tied with string that had once been red but was now the color of rust. Photographs, their edges curled with age. A small leather journal, its pages thick with ink. A pair of dog tags on a chain. A ring, and tucked at the very bottom, wrapped in cloth that fell apart at his touch, a bundle of papers with official seals and numbers. Thomas lifted the journal first. The leather was soft, worn smooth by someone's hands. He opened it carefully, afraid it might crumble. The first page had a date, November 12th, 1952. And below it, in careful handwriting, "If you're reading this and I'm not there to explain, it means I didn't make it home. But that's okay. I made my peace. What matters is what I leave behind." Thomas pulled the candle closer and began to read. The words painted pictures. A young man from Pennsylvania, drafted into a war he didn't understand, fighting in mountains that looked like these. James Walsh had been afraid, the journal admitted. Afraid of dying, but more afraid of dying without meaning anything. So he'd saved his money, bought war bonds with every paycheck, sent them home to his mother with letters about the future. When I get back, he'd written, I'm going to buy the old Miller farm. Marry Sarah, if she'll still have me. Raise a family in the same valley where I learned to fish. Watch my kids grow up safe and free. That's what this is all for. That's what makes it worth it. But James Walsh never made it back. Thomas could tell by the way the journal ended, abruptly, mid-sentence. By the way all these precious things had been left here, locked away in the dark. He picked up the photographs next. Young men, arms linked, grinning at the camera. And there, in the center, a tall soldier with kind eyes and a crooked smile. Written on the back in fading ink, James Walsh, the best of us. Another photograph showed a young woman sitting on a porch swing, dark hair pinned up, wearing a white dress. On the back, Sarah, my reason for everything. The letters were from his mother, from Sarah, from his sister named Margaret. They spoke of ordinary things, spring planting, church socials, the neighbor's new baby. But between the lines, Thomas could read the longing, the fear, the desperate hope that their James would come home. He never did. Thomas's eyes were burning, and not from the candle smoke. He carefully unfolded the papers at the bottom of the box. War bonds, dozens of them, purchased month after month, year after year. Each one marked with James Walsh's name and a military serial number. Each one representing a sacrifice, a hope, a tomorrow that never came. Thomas did the math in his head. Even if these bonds were worth only their face value, even after all these years, they'd be enough to buy a house. Maybe a small farm. Enough to change a life completely. His life. He could take these, cash them, and somehow survive not just the winter, but years to come. Nobody would know. James Walsh was dust and memory now. His mother, Sarah, probably all gone. But would it hurt? The candle flickered, and in its dancing light, Thomas saw his own shadow on the wall. Thin, small, alone, just a boy with nothing, holding someone else's everything. He looked at the photograph of James Walsh again, at those kind eyes, that crooked smile. Looked at the careful handwriting in the journal, the way each letter from home had been preserved, read and reread until the paper was soft. And Thomas understood something then. The fortune in this box wasn't the bonds. It was the love, the hope, the connection between people who believed in each other, who held on even when the world tried to tear them apart. That was what James Walsh had really left behind. That was what was worth keeping. Thomas closed the journal gently, arranged the letters and photographs back in their places. At the very bottom of the box, he found something he'd missed before, an envelope addressed simply to my family. Sealed, never opened. Inside that envelope might be the last words James Walsh ever wrote. The last piece of him. And Thomas knew, with sudden certainty, that those words needed to reach their destination. Even if it took 70 years. Even if it cost him everything. Thomas sat at that desk for a long time, candle burning low, shadows deepening in the corners. The bunker was silent except for the occasional drip of water somewhere in the darkness, a slow heartbeat counting the years. He was hungry, not the kind of hungry you feel when you miss lunch. The kind that hollows you out, makes you lightheaded, makes the world shimmer at the edges. He hadn't eaten a real meal in 3 days. The bread he'd shared with the dog had been meant to last him through tomorrow. The war bonds lay in front of him, crisp despite their age, marked with numbers that meant survival. Food, shelter, warmth, a future that extended past the next snowfall. All he had to do was take them. Walk out of this bunker, find the nearest town, figure out who to talk to. He was an orphan, wasn't he? Alone in the world. Who would judge him for taking what he needed to survive? But even as he thought it, his hand moved to his pocket, to his mother's letter. He didn't need to read it to remember what it said. The words were carved into his heart. Thomas, my sweet boy, the world is going to be hard on you. Harder than it should be. And you'll be tempted, sometimes, to let that hardness into your heart. To take what isn't yours because life hasn't been fair to you. But promise me you won't. Promise me you'll remember that the measure of a person isn't what they take, but what they give. Even when they have almost nothing. Especially then. His mother had been a cleaning woman at the church. Worked until her hands bled. Until the cancer took her voice and then her breath. But she'd never taken anything that wasn't hers. Never cut a corner. Never told a lie to make things easier. She'd been proud in her quiet way. Proud of doing right even when right was hard. Thomas looked at James Walsh's photograph again. This man had been afraid. The journal said so. But he'd gone anyway. Had saved his money, penny by penny, building a future for people he loved. Had written letters home, even when he must have known he might not make it back. Had locked away his treasure not for himself, but for the family waiting. That was the kind of man James Walsh had been. The kind who gave even when giving cost everything. Could Thomas be any less? He stood up, legs stiff from sitting, and carefully began to repack the box. Letters tied with string. Photographs arranged face up so James Walsh could smile at the sky one more time. Journal closed gently. War bond smooth flat. And that sealed envelope, to my family, placed on top where it could be found first. The dog tags he left around his own neck. Just for a while. Just to keep James Walsh company on the journey home. In the journal, on the last page with writing, Thomas found a clue he'd missed before. An address, written in the margin. Walsh Farm, Rural Route 4, Millbrook, PA. In case anyone needs to find me, that's where my heart lives. Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Thomas had no idea where that was, how far, how to get there. He had no money for a bus, no map, nothing but his mother's scarf and his father's courage. and now this box full of someone else's love. But he knew, with the kind of certainty that lives in your bones, that he was going to try. He closed the box, secured the lid, picked it up, felt its weight. It wasn't heavy, but it was substantial, real, important, the kind of thing worth carrying. Before he left, Thomas did something that might seem strange. He stood at attention the way he'd seen soldiers do in movies, the way his father must have done. He held that position for a long moment, there in the candlelight, a thin boy honoring a soldier who'd been gone before he was born. Then he blew out the candle. Darkness filled the bunker like water filling a well. Thomas didn't strike another match. He'd counted his steps on the way in. He could count them on the way out. The journey up was harder than coming down. The box made him clumsy, and twice he stumbled on the stairs. But he kept going, kept climbing toward the cold light filtering through the entrance. When he finally emerged, the day had changed. The sun was lower, painting the snow gold and pink. The forest looked different now, not threatening, almost protective, like it had been keeping watch. Thomas took a breath of cold air, felt it burn his lungs in the best way. He was still hungry, still alone, still had no idea how he was going to get to Pennsylvania or what he'd do when he got there. But for the first time in months, maybe years, he had a purpose, something beyond just surviving to the next day. He had a promise to keep, a fortune to deliver, a family to find, and that, Thomas thought as he started walking, was worth more than all the gold in the world. The dog was waiting at the edge of the clearing, gray muzzle lifted like it was asking a question. Thomas smiled. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go home, even if we have to walk there." And together, boy and dog headed into the gold light, into the future, into whatever came next. The journey took Thomas 3 weeks. 3 weeks of walking roads that turned from dirt to pavement and back to dirt again. 3 weeks of sleeping in barns when farmers let him, in doorways when they didn't. 3 weeks of the dog at his side, loyal as sunrise, sharing whatever scraps they found. He'd asked directions at every town, every gas station, every church. Showed them the address written in James Walsh's journal. Most people were kind. An old woman in Ohio gave him sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. A truck driver carried him 50 miles closer. A pastor let him sleep in the church basement and didn't ask too many questions. And slowly, mile by mile, Pennsylvania got closer. You know what kept him going? It wasn't the thought of reward or recognition. It was imagining the moment. That moment when he'd knock on a door and hand someone this box. When he'd give them back a piece of someone they'd lost. When he'd prove that love doesn't die, it just waits. Millbrook turned out to be smaller than Thomas expected. One main street, a handful of shops, houses scattered on hills like seeds thrown by a generous hand. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where secrets are hard to keep and memories last forever. The woman at the post office looked at him strangely when he walked in. A thin boy with a worn scarf, a skinny dog, and a metal box held like it contained the crown jewels. But her eyes were kind. "I'm looking for the Walsh family," Thomas said, his voice rough from disuse. "Walsh Farm, rural Route 4. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or sadness. She was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "There's only Margaret left now. Margaret Walsh Patterson. She's quite old. Lives in the old farmhouse alone since her husband passed. You know her?" Thomas shook his head. "No, ma'am, but I have something that belongs to her. Something important." The woman studied him, and Thomas could see her deciding whether to trust him. Whatever she saw on his face must have satisfied her, because she wrote down directions on a piece of paper and handed it to him. "You be gentle with her," she said. "Margaret's had a hard life. Lost her brother in the war. Never quite got over it." Thomas nodded, took the paper, and headed back out into the cold afternoon. The Walsh farm sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by fields gone to winter brown. The house was small but well kept, white paint fresh, smoke rising from the chimney. A porch wrapped around the front, and on that porch, wrapped in blankets, sat an elderly woman. She watched Thomas approach, her eyes sharp despite her age. The dog stayed close to his leg, sensing this moment was important. "Can I help you, young man?" Her voice was strong, carrying across the yard. Thomas stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. His hands were shaking. After all this way, all these miles, suddenly he didn't know what to say. So he let the box speak for him. He held it up, and even from a distance, he could see her face change. "Where did you get that?" Not angry, breathless. "I found it," Thomas said. "In a bunker. In the forest. I think it belonged to your brother." Margaret Walsh Patterson stood up slowly, blankets falling away. She came down the steps with a steadiness that surprised him, and when she reached for the box, her hands were trembling as much as his. She opened it right there in the yard, cold wind forgotten, pulled out the photographs, and made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "James," she whispered. "Oh, James." She looked through everything. The letters from their mother, dead 50 years now. The photograph of Sarah, who'd married someone else and moved away when James never came home. The war bonds, preserved perfectly, worth more now than they'd ever been. And then she found the sealed envelope. "To my family." Margaret looked at Thomas with tears streaming down her face. Would you read it to me? My eyes aren't what they used to be." Thomas took the envelope with reverent hands. "Open it carefully." Inside was a single sheet of paper, James Walsh's handwriting steady and clear. He read, "To my family. If you're reading this, I didn't make a home, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry I won't be there for Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings. Sorry I won't meet your children or dance at your weddings. But I'm not sorry I went, because I went believing in something. Believing that love is stronger than fear, that home is worth fighting for, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have to. Take the bonds, build something good with them, live the life I couldn't, and know that wherever I am, I'm proud of you. I'm proud to be your brother, your son, your friend. Don't mourn me forever. Just remember me sometimes on quiet evenings and know I loved you. That's enough. That's everything. James." The silence that followed was holy. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, eyes closed, and Thomas knew she was somewhere else. Somewhere 70 years ago, saying goodbye to a brother who never came home. Finally, she opened her eyes and looked at Thomas. Really looked at him. Saw the worn clothes, the thin face, the way he swayed slightly on his feet. "You walked a long way to bring me this," she said. "Yes, ma'am. You could have kept it. The bonds alone, you could have sold them, started over." Thomas thought about that. About cold nights and empty stomachs. About the choice he'd made in the darkness of that bunker. "My mother taught me better than that," he said simply. Margaret Walsh Patterson studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was James Walsh's crooked smile, carried forward through time. "Your mother was a wise woman. What's your name, son?" "Thomas, ma'am." "Well, Thomas, I live in this big house all by myself. Too many rooms, too many memories, too much quiet. And it seems to me that a boy who'd walk 3 weeks to return what isn't his, well, that's the kind of boy who understands what family really means." She paused, and her voice got softer. "How would you feel about staying for supper? And maybe longer than that, if you'd like." Thomas felt something break open in his chest. Something that had been locked up tight for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "I'd like that," he whispered. "I'd like that very much." Margaret nodded toward the dog. "Your friend is welcome too." James always loved dogs. That evening, as the sun set over the Pennsylvania hills, Thomas sat at a kitchen table set for 2. Margaret made soup from a recipe her mother had taught her, and she told stories about James. About the boy who'd climbed trees too high and came home with scraped knees. About the young man who'd kissed Sarah goodbye at this very door and promised to come back. About the soldier who'd sent letters home, filled with hope, even when hope was hard to find. And Thomas told his story, too, about his mother, about the orphanage, about walking north until he found a bunker full of memories, about choosing honor over survival, and how somehow that choice had led him here. The war bonds were cashed eventually. Margaret used them to fix up the farm, to hire Thomas as a hand, to give him the room that had been James's. But that wasn't the fortune. Not really. The fortune was this: a boy who'd been alone in the world finding a family. A woman who'd lived with grief for 70 years, finally getting to say goodbye. A soldier's love reaching across decades to bring 2 lonely people together. That's what was in the box. Not paper and ink in old photographs, but connection, hope, the promise that even when we're gone, what we love continues, that the things we leave behind can still change lives, still matter, still make the world a little less cold. Maybe you've been searching for something too. Maybe you felt alone, wondered if anyone would remember you, if anything you do really matters. This story is for you. It's a reminder that every small kindness, every choice to do right when wrong is easier, every moment of love you give to the world, it all counts. It all matters. If this story touched you, help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Hit that button below. Give us a like. And tell me in the comments where you're from. What city, what state? Because stories like Thomas's, they belong to all of us. They remind us what we're capable of, what we can be. The dog is sleeping by the fire now. Thomas is home. And somewhere, maybe, James Walsh is smiling. Thanks for walking this road with me. Until next time, remember, the greatest fortunes aren't found in the ground. They're found in the choices we make and the love we leave behind.